Okay, we can get started. So thank you all for being here today. It's great to see you here. My name is Julie Miller. I am with the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, and this webinar is called The State of the State and International Education, presented by Jeff Whitehead, who is Director of the University of Pittsburgh Study Abroad Office, and Lisa Donatelli, Chief of Staff of Arcadia University's College of Global Studies. So I'm just going to do a quick tech overview, and then we'll move on to their presentations. As you see, you are muted by default here. We have about close to 25 people here, so you'll be muted throughout the presentation, but we do encourage you to use the chat feature to talk with each other and leave comments and questions during the presentations. And you can also use the chat feature to message me directly if you experience any technical issues during the webinar. So you're probably familiar with Zoom by now, but just as a refresher, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat button, and that'll open up a box on the right-hand side where you can select individual people. So you can choose my name if you need to message me directly, or you can message the whole group. If your connection drops and you can't get back into the webinar, please email me and I'll try to troubleshoot with you. You can do that by responding directly to the email I sent yesterday that had this meeting link in it. And I'll also drop my email address in the chat for easy reference when I'm done here. So today's webinar is co-sponsored by 3 membership networks. At the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, we are members of the first 2 and we host the 3rd. So those networks are the Pennsylvania Council for International Education, also known as PACE, the Philadelphia Higher Education Network for Neighborhood Development, known as FEND, and the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, known as the Collaborative for short. While these 3 networks all have different missions, their missions do overlap at the intersection of supporting diverse people working together on campuses and in communities to co-create more welcoming, just, inclusive, and sustainable communities. So yes, our aim with this webinar is, of course, to foster inclusive dialogue and sharing. If there are any racist or discriminatory messages during the dialogue, we retain the right to remove participants if necessary. But as I said, we do encourage questions and conversation in the spirit of advancing shared understanding over in the chat. So as you noticed when you joined, the webinar is being recorded. We just wanted to make sure that you're aware. So feel free to have your cameras on or off, whatever you're comfortable with. And we will share a brief poll at the end so you can give some feedback about your experience today. So again, my name is Julie Miller. Feel free to message me if you have any issues. And I will now pass the mic over to Dr. Eric Hartman, who is Executive Director at the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship.
Yeah. Thanks, Julie. Welcome, everyone. And I just wanted to take a brief second to say welcome. Julie, thank you for that overview. And I think in this moment to particularly emphasize PACE and its role co-hosting this webinar, the Pennsylvania Council for International Education. I'm, as a person who was born in Pennsylvania, thrilled to be back in Pennsylvania, and really ecstatic really, that the 2 institutions represented here by Lisa Donatelli and Jeff Whitehead are institutions on each side of the state that are international connectors in a really profound way. And it really, for me, harkens back to some of the strengths of the state. In the 1830s, Philadelphia was the most diverse city in the United States in terms of different ethnicities. In the 1920s, the Cathedral of Learning was built through a cooperation by different national communities in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So as we, and most recently, Duolingo, the language app Duolingo, was founded by immigrants at Carnegie Mellon University. Really extraordinary set of resources in Pennsylvania. That's only a couple. So Lisa Donatelli, over the last 20 years, has had an incredible career in international education at Georgetown, Bucknell, Rollins College. She's currently Chief of Staff at Arcadia University, which works with over 250 different universities, connecting pre-pandemic more than 2,500 students with international education annually, and actually sending more than 70% of Arcadia's own students internationally. And outside of Philadelphia, an extraordinary institution here in the eastern part of the state. Near and dear to my heart, University of Pittsburgh, where I did my doctorate, and I have to say, benefited from the university's profound global strengths when it comes to things like foreign language area studies fellowships, Latin American studies graduate programs and things of that nature. And I've been fortunate to know Jeff Whitehead since sometime early in that process. Astonishingly, Jeff's been at Pitt for getting close to 20 years, and as an institution with the university and with Pacey in his own right, as a former president, but also a kind of, I'd say, backbone facilitator continuously. So really excited to hear from both of you today and to get into the discussion. I know that's key to what each of you are interested in as well. I'm going to be monitoring chat and seeing if we have themes to pull out. And just to get a sense of who's in the room, we like to invite everyone to share who they are, kind of, maybe who you are professionally, and attention or an opportunity that you're seeing right now in education abroad. So what's on your mind, essentially, what brought you to the webinar? So I'll take a moment, reflect, and do that myself, and we'll take about a minute to let those roll in to see where people are coming from. I'm going to encourage folks to hit enter, and it's all going to come flooding in. It'll be good to see as that happens. And thanks for those who have already shared. And a reminder as we turn over to the presenters, thanks everyone, it's really coming in now. As we turn over to the presenters to kick off, we can keep the conversation going on the side as the presentation moves forward. So we look forward to that. Thanks,
Great.
Lisa.
Are we ready to take over? I need Julie to share her screen, and thank you. Thank you for that, Julie. I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon to have this conversation. I think for so many of us, it's clear what a state of chaos we're in right now and how much disruption there's been to mobility, to our field, to how we do our work. So everything has changed, at least that's the way I feel. So when I was asked to be a part of this conversation, I started making a long list of sort of everything I thought about the state of the field right now. But really, I think the better place to start is by sharing two stories of conversations I had recently that really put things in perspective for me. One was with a VP on the campus at Arcadia, and I was excited to tell her that we have students on site right now, in country, and that we're very proud of that. We're happy about the experience that they're having, but that it was an incredible amount of work, right? So we're the same amount of work for such a small number of students. And she turned to me and said, well, Lisa, do you think it's worth it? And at first I thought she was asking me, do I still value what I do? Sort of that personal question. But then I actually realized her question was, is it worth operating at all when you're only serving such a small number of students? And that was a question that, of course, I think for most of us in the field, it just never occurs to us. Of course, we value what we do. We know why we're here. So that really took me to an entirely different place of saying, look, there is this pendulum here and we are swinging and we are asking questions that we might not have asked or had asked of us for the last 20 years. So that was one conversation. The second I had was with a colleague at a university I used to work at, and they were talking about bringing students to campus and the international students that would be coming in. And we had worked hard when I was there to really make sure that international students were considered a part of the regular community on campus, integrated into all of the services and offices, like I'm sure so many of you do every day. And she said she was in a meeting talking about how to support students in the COVID world on campus. And the entire room turned to her and said, well, you're going to be taking care of the international students, right? You'll figure out what to do with them in quarantine, and you'll figure out how to feed them, and you'll figure out, which was really absolutely the opposite of all of the work they had done to integrate those students, have them be considered like every other population. So for her, it was a big swing to suddenly saying, well, your office is now the sole responsible party for that group of students. So two instances in which I really saw the pendulum swinging and the conversation changing. And so for me, the points I'm going to make in a minute, just four of them, it's really an existential crisis for me. That's sort of where I feel I am. And I'm hoping that Jeff, when I turn it over to him, will bring some sort of rationality to some of my crisis, and really talk a little bit more about moving us forward. But I'm going to pose some sort of hopefully provocative questions and reminders for us of things that we should be really asking ourselves. So I feel like the way forward for us right now, the current state of chaos in the field, the best way forward is to actually start by changing the conversation. So Julie, if you, yeah, perfect. All right, my 4 points, some of those are based on John Hutzig's article. If any of you read it recently, the post-COVID internationalization article that he had out with NAFSA. One of his first points is to remind all of us, right, that global should be part of the core mission of your institution. Well, we all remember that and those days of bringing that into our mission, and making sure that it is considered to be necessary. That seems reasonable enough, but one of the questions I think we need to ask ourselves is putting global in the core mission enough? Is by putting it in there as sort of a freestanding entity, an item, one of a core piece set of items, is that really giving it the place that it needs? Or does it still stand alone, so much so that it can be removed in a crisis situation, that someone could just think it to be something we can set aside? So one of my biggest challenges right now is to remind, and we do this at Arcadia a lot as we re-envision our global strategy, is to remind the campus that it isn't an end to it. It's not an end. It's the means by which we should be doing everything. Global is the means. And when we start to integrate it into all areas of our institutional life, the learning, the engagement, and all of the offices on campus, again, the old days of trying to find allies, it's the same concept, but I really think the way to protect our field is to start talking about global as a means and not just an end. My second point or question is to talk about decision making specifically at universities, but I think in education in general. So I think this applies to K through 12 as well. And our tolerance for risk. I think we're all aware that university decision making is painfully slow. I remember going into my boss's office many times and giving her an idea and saying, I'll be back in 3 years, when that becomes something that someone wants to pick up and run with. So it is slow. It's always been slow. But even more importantly, this idea of what is your tolerance for risk? That is the question we're asking each other now in COVID world. How much risk are you willing to tolerate in sending students? And the fact of the matter is we've never really defined our tolerance for risk. It's been an ambiguous concept and it's been largely untested, right? So we really haven't thought about it as much as we should. And our director of health and safety at the college said something the other day in relation to this that I thought was so important. She said, right now in COVID world, all travel is high risk travel. And so that's where you start to reframe what it is that we're doing now in sending students abroad. And I saw there was a good question about the ethics of sending students abroad in this environment. I'm excited to talk about that. But it is very challenging to sort of think about risk has to be redefined. I think many of our leaders have swung the pendulum back to the idea of we must avoid all liability and all risk. And we're not talking about the better way to think about liability and risk, which is we're mitigating it. The risk is now a normal part of our lives. So the conversation we need to be having with our leaders and our university council is much more about mitigating risk as the standard, not avoiding it. Because if we're going to seek to avoid it, our field is really going to suffer. And I do have anxiety about that. I have real anxiety about that. The next point that I'd like to make John Hudsick again raised this in his article about remembering that we can experience the global through the local. We've talked about this for years. It was a hot topic many years ago at many of my institutions, and then it sort of fell away. I think our K through 12 colleagues, if they're here, probably excel at this, finding the global and the local. And I do think we need to be careful. The conversation right now about innovative local engagement that has global context, it's necessary and it's important. But what worries me is we're talking about it as a temporary state. Let's do this until mobility returns, and then we'll go back to mobility looking the way that it did. And because it's likely to be many years before that reality of mobility looking the same returns, if at all, I think we're losing an opportunity if we don't think more and collaborate more and be more intentional about creating those local opportunities, and that also includes virtual opportunities, as long-standing permanent concepts of our program portfolio, as ways to move students through a continuum of global experiences, not just a temporary fix in this current situation. So I really encourage us to look at global local a little bit differently. My final point is about partnerships. And this has really been a crazy moment for the College of Global Studies in trying to support over 200 universities in sending students, in watching what COVID has done to the way we interact with each other on partnerships. I think COVID has forced a lot of institutions, due to their university council and their decision making, to drill down into looking at practice much more than we ever did. So asking question after question after question, what are you doing about cleaning? What are you doing about transportation? What are you doing about whether a student can move their furniture once they move into their apartment? And these are actual questions that we have answered in dozens and dozens of surveys. And we find that there's a focus on trust in that partner being equated with looking at specific practices they have and then drilling down into individual program specific practice. And it really gets to a level of detail that we're missing the point and the bigger picture around trust. And I think that we need to be careful about the impact that COVID is having on our partnerships and the way we look at them. And I think the easiest way to explain it for me is to think about trusting each other in our approaches and not in the practice, right? So starting to talk to each other and our leaders about what are our approaches to the way we look at academic continuity or student health and safety or student engagement, and saying we need to align. If you'd like to work with us as a partner, we should be aligned in our approach to these things. But since the day-to-day conditions change, and they change so quickly, we cannot focus on asking the practice question and then asking it a week later when the conditions change and a week later. And I really think it's an exciting moment to build a different way of trusting each other as partners if we think about looking at trust as an approach and not trusting in practice. So those are my big existential crises and big questions that I'm asking myself, and I'm excited to talk more, but I hope Jeff will bring it down to reality a little bit for us.
Thanks so much. I'll pop mine up real fast here so that I can take the reins. You should see my screen right now. And I will, I don't know that I've ever been considered someone who grounds things particularly in reality. So thanks, Lisa. I tend to be a person who stretches limits and reaches for pretty high and lofty visions. And so pushes a little harder and further than perhaps I should. And so what has happened for us is, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Whitehead. I've been the director at the University of Pittsburgh in Study Abroad and now Study Away for the last decade, and I've been in my office for 18 years, as Erica said. And I met Eric very early on, where we had some of these framing conversations that I think are now all of a sudden coming full circle back around to to revisit us through what has become a pretty paralyzing pandemic for our field. And as Lisa has said, it is really the first test, and it wasn't just the first test for study abroad, as we at once called it, but it was the test for world and global travel and movement. And I think that we are now seeing just how risk averse the global community is when things like this happen. You see a lot of protectionism happen very fast, and people moving very quickly, which fostered some spread. And now we're left with a situation where we're considering what we do moving forward. And I frame that because what we ended up doing when the same thing happened to us has happened to everybody. Last 15 years for us, and we're a mid-sized R1, and so we had a period of amazing growth. We flipped through the IIE book every year, and we kept raising through the ranks. We kept having a higher percentage of people going abroad. We kept building programs and having new students come, and we thought we were doing a really good job. So, we're getting there. We're reaching new populations. We were able to increase staff and staff up in the schools where we wanted to continue to foster some global programming. But what we were saying, and what in some respects I think we said all the way until March, is we were using the term global programming because we liked that term, but that's not what we were actually doing. What we were actually doing is study abroad. Global programming is and has now in a very real way become something much different for us, which we'll talk about in a second. And I'm trying to follow the chat as well as we go. And I see some of your questions and comments on that front, because what I think we are now is not study abroad practitioners, but instead global learning practitioners. And I think that we need to widen our definition of what that is and means. And you heard Lisa say a little bit about this in her second last bullet, and which I think for us is the one that resonates at Pitt, the one that resonates the most, because it's what we spent the last 6-9 months doing. Even before COVID was happening, we were making this transition, but we realized, particularly in March and as early as January, as we were starting to evacuate and cancel programming in Asia, we realized that we had become a little complacent, and we had relied entirely on study abroad, and then in some respects in dribs and drabs on study away for our global programming. And we were disassociating ourselves with other people that were doing global programming on our campus because we didn't consider it our global programming because it wasn't study away. And so, or study abroad and study away. And so what we ended up doing was rethinking and reshaping how we view global education entirely. And we've become much more inclusive in nature on that front and much less reliant on mobility. And this is generally what we've started to do here. So in January through March, we had a complete collapse of all of our programming. And for those of you who know us, we have a pretty conservative institution in terms of how we handle risk, also dovetailing on Lisa's previous point. And so when we had all of this, we canceled everything. We canceled everything through January of 2021, basically very quickly. And we now are having the conversation about spring tomorrow, on Friday. So we were at a major crossroads in April. And we said, okay, instead of thinking about how we can just rebuild the old machine and just wait and bide our time until that is ready to go again, if that is even the case, let's actually get serious about some of these questions of inclusion, of financial barriers, of different types of opportunities and experiences that our students can have without actually having to leave the country. And some of that talks about how you can do, and I saw an earlier comment about how we can do service learning locally. And we've started to explore some of these things. We've started to explore virtual. I threw that in one of my comments, but someone had beaten me to it, I saw, so it's like thinking, and we're exploring that. And we're also exploring how we can serve populations of students that we didn't even know really existed. I mean, we knew they were there, and we like to throw out the catchphrases, and we like to talk about how we had 1 or 2 students from these populations studying abroad. But our TRIO students, for instance, are an example of this, and that we have now really dramatically revisited how we can serve our TRIO students, because they can't leave, basically, and they are in a position where, because of most of their life situations, they're also working. They're sometimes not traditional students in terms of age or life experiences and things that they're managing. And so we had the conversation with their director, and they basically took the line and ran and said, let's do a lot of this stuff together. So we had some really, really interesting early success. As of the summertime, we started to redefine our purpose. And we started to say, okay, we can't be in a position where the only thing that our institution thinks of us as providing value is on mobility, meaning getting on an airplane, getting off an airplane. It made us a little bit of a one-trick pony. People felt bad for us. I mean, it was the sentiment was great, and I have nothing but kind words to say to our institution and the administration, because they made us feel comfortable and not in jeopardy or a threat, which I know is not the case everywhere. And so, as we've seen in the field, it has been a difficult time, but we felt pretty supported. And so what we were able to do immediately was look at technology, our human capital, to try to look at what a culture change on campus might be. And I had people on both poles. I had some people who were saying, look, study abroad without study abroad isn't study abroad, so what are y'all doing? And then I had other people who basically came to the table and was like, finally, you are finally understanding that there are not going to be people from our department who are ever able to just pick themselves up and go. And so it was a really interesting experience over the summer as we started talking to leadership, as we started talking to deans and faculty within the respective units and schools, because what that allowed us to do was open up a much more diverse portfolio of opportunities, which we are currently finishing for the spring as we speak. And I've got a menu of things to go up to our leadership as early as the early piece of next week, so that we can start to redefine who we are now. And what I think in terms of that means for advocacy, when I was the president of PACE, which I know sounds like so long ago, I've been in PACE for some time now, and we were talking about advocacy. We were really talking about how we can work with the K-12s, that they had resources that allowed K-12 students the opportunity to learn about the globe. And we were talking about money so that people could study abroad in college. Those were the two primary lines of thinking. What I am interested in us doing, particularly for our K-12 folks in the room, and you heard Lisa say this too, is to realize that there really is opportunity for higher education professionals to learn from what K-12 is doing. Because I have heard some of my friends now who are on both fences of the political landscape, who are all doing really creative things in K-12, say, you guys should really be doing this stuff because you're vulnerable. And some of that is the things that we've just mentioned in chat, like virtual exchanges, project teams that happen together with our partnerships. And so you heard Lisa mention that as well. Most of us, I think, will have to start to think about how we reframe our partnerships so that it's no longer, so it blows the lid off of this notion that in order to have some type of really viable partner, it's somebody going from the States to that place and somebody going from that place to the States and doing the old body swap model. And I think that some of those days are gone. And I do think that there's a lot of interesting work that we can be doing so that we can actually, even as higher educators, take a look at what PACE has put into the Standards Aligned system, which is the SAS, as I have here. That's a resource bank of information that K-12 teachers can use to increase global awareness and learning in their respective curriculums. And we can then take a lot of those ideas to the Department of Education, because what we have found is the Department of Education was not terrifically interested in supporting our notion that we needed to be sending as many people abroad as we possibly could. They weren't terrifically interested in that. Instead, they were talking more about how can we do workforce development? How can we avoid brain drain? And how can we make sure that the dollars that we are spending in global education in the state of Pennsylvania are going to people who actually need it the most, as opposed to people who are able to afford college education or who would be going anyway. And so we've now, as a PACE, as well as an institutional community, needed to look at these types of issues, because it does mean that we have to sort of lean in on this idea that we have to redefine global education so that those two things, global education and study abroad, are not necessarily pure synonymize anymore. Instead, what we have to think about is breaking that down and saying study abroad, as Lisa has said as well, is a piece of global education. And I know that in terms of my own thinking of it, I used to frame it as, well, it's the best piece of global education. And now we have some different thoughts on that. Now we talk about this idea as a sort of stratum of things that people can do as they work their way up through. And we have the hope that by starting people early, even as freshmen or even into high school, where we can potentially break this invisible barrier that exists between K-12 and higher education, we can think about involving high school students and college students on project teams that involve people from overseas. And we can do most of that in a virtual landscape. We can take a look at some of our existing partners. We can think about how we might be able to do things that are a little bit more ingenuitive and clever than the old bilateral exchange model. We also can start to talk again to whatever the future of our lovely state leadership will be when we know what that will look like after November, in a different way. And instead of what we had tried to do previously, which was push forward a piece of legislation. And for those of you who know me, know that there was a sort of rallying cry for several years in Pacey. And unfortunately, it died on the Senate floor because a single individual just wouldn't put it up to vote. Instead, we can actually dissect that a little bit and start to push pieces of it to really the areas of interest that don't necessarily require legislation to have some of this happen. We know the Department of Education will be interested in pieces of the legislation that we tried to push forward, so we'll start working on that line of thinking. We know that there are certain senators and representatives of the House who are interested in some of what we're doing and would be able to do task force and project teams to see that we can maybe try to redirect some of the funding that goes out to education toward global learning, and not just study abroad. It reminds me in closing of a conversation that I had with someone who was running for governor. And he called me some nasty things, of course, and then we got serious about what it was that we were actually trying to do. And I remember distinctly, and I have thought about it often over these last several months, because he basically said, "Oh, you're talking about global education, you're talking about study abroad, right?" And my answer was, well, no, we're talking about global education as a whole. But really, in those days, I was talking about study abroad. And it really was much more about what we were doing to move people. And I think that we are at a position now where we can transcend a lot of that, where we can work together. I mean, in some respects, I take the silver lining approach on this front and think about how we, particularly as Pennsylvanians, I mean, I see people on this call that I know very well. I also see people from outside of global education, so to speak, where we can actually try to bind together a little bit more than we have in the past, when it's been much more reliant on one modality to achieve the aim of having people learn about world cultures and increase their global competence. And so I will end there, and I will open this up. Hopefully, Lisa, I did a decent job of contextualizing and pragmatizing some of those things in what we are going to be doing. I'll close up by saying that our plan is going to include, and when we roll it out, we're going to have things like virtual internships. We're going to be building project teams across countries. We're going to be doing a lot of virtual curriculum that doesn't compete against what we're offering, but will hopefully complement and add to existing curriculum. And then, of course, we will do mobility again in some form and fashion when that's possible. But we'd like to add a lot of different flavors now, so that instead of having just one thing on the agenda that we can do, we've got a nice family of things that people can use to engage with us in our office, so that we actually believe we can touch a much wider swath of the institution than we did in the past. So I will stop sharing. And I have hopefully framed this. And so I'm hoping, yes, you're right. There is a long and impressive history in K-12, and much of what I think, and I'm going to be critical of myself and, my peers on this front. I think, and I've had this argument since joining Pacey. I like this comment, and since I can see it right on my screen, I'm going to address it right off. I think that higher education has ignored K-12 for far too long. I'll be blunt. I think that K-12 has an incredibly long and impressive history of doing this. I think I alluded to it with some of my friends who were on this board and teaching me a lot about what global learning actually was outside of moving people. And so I do think that it can apply at any level of education, as you're saying here, Jay. And I think that it is high time for us as global educators, particularly those of us who are sitting in universities, to abandon this notion that there is some chasm between what happens in K-12 and what happens in higher education, particularly now when the playing field is pretty level, and we're not going to have as much mobility in the foreseeable future as we used to have, where we could hang our hat on what we did as opposed to looking at what was possible at K-12 because of resources and because of the much greater difficulty in moving people around. And so I'm excited by that comment. I think that it's time. I think that we have a lot to learn from K-12 as higher educators, and I think that we also, as folks who will likely be bringing these students to our campuses, have a duty to thinking about how we may improve the experience on our campuses so that they can actually continue to gain some of the global learning and global skills that we want them to once they arrive. So I got into Q&A early on you, Eric. Sorry about that.
That's great. That's great. I just want to say thank you to Jeff and Lisa for the presentations. And since we are, I'd say, a right-sized group here, I want to encourage folks, if they're interested in popping in a question vocally, that you know, to raise a hand or even just unmute screen and microphones, we can hear you, or pop questions in the chat. I do have kind of two related questions, really. One question I've been thinking a lot about. I'm optimistic in ways that may parallel with some of what was just recently shared about the ways we have new opportunities to do important kinds of global learning domestically. And I've been a little bit troubled, that's putting it too mildly. I am really troubled by the way in which higher education is continuously formed by ranking systems. And it's just quite on my radar that rankings and international ed, and I'm not as deeply in the field as Lisa or Jeff. So the question is really about what routes might we have toward thinking about how rankings might be shifted as we see these shifts, because I fear that we're going to get pulled down the same path that has been framed as problematic so far in this conversation.
Boy, that's a tough question, Eric, because I do think that in higher ed, there is always going to be a reliance on some form of ranking, though I am really hopeful that in some of what I have seen in terms of entry requirements have started to change. For instance, there have been some of the age-old tests that you had to do that are now starting to fall by the wayside in preference for storytelling approaches and talking about what you actually are, who you actually are, and what you've actually done prior to coming to college. And so I do hope that that starts to move us away from what I liken as a 1950s way of thinking about how we rank ourselves as higher educators, and more towards trying to find students that meet the types of cultures that we have on our campuses. But I do think it is going to be difficult for us to move away from the US News and World Report ranking system on where we are in the short term. And I do think that we have a duty as global educators to help push that needle. And I think that we can start to think about ourselves as agents of change to say, we aren't necessarily interested in where we fall in terms of the rankings. And I'm not a rankings guy, so I'm not an easy one to ask on that front, because I don't care about numbers that much, but instead what we deliver. And so if I think that our package of opportunities will showcase itself if we really do have something special to share. Yeah, I don't know that that's going to change some of the vice presidents and presidents and provosts and chancellors of the world, but it would be nice.
Right. Right, and I mean, I'm raising it because the values are so important to do the kinds of work we're doing, and the IIE framing in any case is fundamentally about mobility, though there's this more textured set of awards like the Simon Award or things like that. I appreciate Molly's point that, you know, perhaps we'll see some movement among so-called highly ranked institutions on how they frame this. Lisa, did you have a comment? And I also, Katie, you might have a question.
Well, I wanted to let Katie go first because I'm going to jump off an idea and make another comment, so not directly in response to the question. So maybe, I don't know if Katie had a question, you think? I think I'll take that as a no, I suppose. She'll come back around.
Here she's coming. Go ahead, Katie.
No, gosh, I was coming to say I didn't have a comment, but while I'm on the line, sure. Well, you guys just put me on this. Was I like raising my hand? No, I was going to add, and I don't know if rankings out externally will change, but certainly similar to Jeff, you know, we're already looking at, you know, how can we change our internal reporting? How can we make sure we're gathering data? Because from summer, whatever this past summer was, time is amazed to me. This past summer, you know, we had groups across campus doing global virtual experiences. And now I'm back to where we were many years ago when kind of mobility was decentralized, and it took us a long time to gather that information. And so I'm trying to do some quick work to to start gathering that virtual information from across campus, which is doable, but you kind of have to get on top of it, because we already have now to backtrack between summer, fall, and whatever's happening this winter and spring. So internally, yes. Externally, I'd be hopeful, but of course, this will take many years as people start implementing tracking and new tracking systems. So.
And Katie, I saw your question earlier on spring. We actually make a call as an institution tomorrow on that front, where our big committee will meet. From what I know of the field writ large, I think it's going to be about 50-50. Yeah, I think there's going to be about half the group that decides to push forward and about half that doesn't. I know some big
optimistic.
I
think that's optimistic.
You think that's too optimistic, Lisa?
Hi, as the person over here with 250 universities working with us, I hope that it's half, and you're probably right, Jeff. But for us, what we're seeing, let's see, we probably have in the hopper, maybe 20% of our schools have said yes, and maybe another 30% are undecided, and the rest are already at no.
So it'll be under 50 then. And I'm trusting your data on this, Lisa,
really
from the provider side.
Depressing.
Yeah.
Very depressing. But it does go to the points that have been made a couple times through the chat, and sort of also jumping off of what Katie was saying. I like this discussion around mobility, because I started to think that I was equating the market or student interest or with mobility, and saying like we're not losing the market. So the interest that the students have in engaging in these experiences is not decreasing, and we need to take those opportunities to continue to build new opportunities, and not to equate it with mobility and say therefore this has gone away because we can't send the students. So I've taken some hope in the idea that the market is still here, so to speak. I know that's not a term we use, but the student interest is still there, even if mobility isn't.
Well, speaking of interest, actually, I heard kind of latent in Jeff's comments, almost a kind of asset mapping when you think about where high schools are and how global learning happens and where it happens, and then the candidate for governor who was really presumably thinking about how do young people get prepared for the world in which they live, which is a different question than how can I study abroad, right? And I just wonder, it's a fairly open question, so apologies for that, but it's where my mind went. What opportunities are there for new kinds of alliances or ally building? It sounds like maybe you've been doing some of that on campus as well, Jeff. So maybe it's expanding that in the sort of cross-sectoral sense. Where should we be looking for alliances as we reimagine what we do?
So I can certainly address that, but Lisa, do you want to go first since I talked first last time?
That's fine. I'll come up the rear.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, and I think we noticed. I think Lisa's previous point's a really important one too, and we noticed that over the summer, which I think is important to note here, in that we very quickly had to pivot to develop some programming for all of the lost curriculum on which people banked and experiences on which people banked. And so we found that, yes, there is still a market, and there is still demand. And it was all virtual in the summer, and it went just fine. And so what we started to think about then was, okay, maybe we know that mobility is important to us, but maybe it's not the end all be all. And so maybe we need to start to think about how we can move further into the campus community, and then further still out into our wider communities around us, instead of sitting in, within our invisible borders of a campus. So we started to look at community contacts. We started to look at what our historical providers could do for us that was sans mobility with their partners, where we can do some interesting things. We immediately ramped up some programming in China for our Chinese students who were marooned there, using some historical partners. So we learned a couple of things. We learned that we actually can pivot pretty quickly based on partnerships, and can ramp up some new program models pretty quickly based on partnerships. And so we actually are really excited about the platform of things that are possible. And, you know, I won't go into tremendous detail now because I could talk about this all day, but we've talked about things like 1-credit courses that map to specific UN SDGs. We've talked about 1-credit courses that are about a particular country, where you can stack these things to get to our normal 3 or 6 credit blocks, whatever the case may be for your campus. We've talked about virtual internships that don't replace actual internships, but complement them. We've talked about a lecture bank of materials from our partners overseas that don't necessarily replace things that will be happening on campus, but would allow a faculty to come to us and say, hey, I'm teaching Introduction to Shakespeare. Do you have any really cool lectures that your partners in London have given you on Shakespeare? And we can say, sure, let me pull this one where we walked around the Globe Theater with a Steadicam out, and you can show it to your class. So we actually have started to think about how we can leverage partnerships, not just in Pittsburgh, but also globally, to create some really interesting and diverse curriculum. We'll start rolling some of that out soon. So we're excited about the platform we're building.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things, a couple of non-obvious ones and a couple of obvious ones. I think it's given us a new opportunity to work with career services in just a way that we haven't been able to open the discussion as easily. So that's been really exciting. We've had tremendous success talking about our virtual and internship and applied learning programs through other avenues, Handshake, other venues. Now that we're all looking at all of these platforms, we're recognizing that we can connect to colleagues in different offices around the nation. That's been really exciting. I do also, to Jeff's point around how to use partnerships, overseas partnerships, not only collaborating on lectures, but we've tried to make a point of pulling in our partners and saying, do you have any virtual learning opportunities that are distinctly your country, right? Not just principles of marketing in Australia, but something that is unique that we can pull in under an umbrella of our sort of online learning portfolio, and to actually support our partners in that by pulling in some of their courses and putting them on our website and promoting them in other ways. I think that could work for exchange partners as well. Just a really wonderful way of getting students to connect and supporting partnerships. The third is connecting with centers for teaching and learning, or whatever they're called on your campuses. That has been such a tremendous benefit for us as we try to work on the all modes concept, to really learn from each other, talk about pedagogy in a different way, use expertise on campus in areas around teaching and learning that we wouldn't normally have done. And that's been, I think, probably our most robust area of learning and collaboration in the last couple of months that's created just really new conversations for us.
It's the same for us, and we've worked with our Center for Teaching and Learning as well, very broadly, to deliver some things overseas, but also to deliver what we ended up ramping up for the campus community itself, which we're calling Flex Pid. And so it has been a really interesting relationship. I think you're exactly right, Lisa.
You know, Lisa, you also, when you were sharing, you mentioned the importance of trusting through relationships during this era of change. And I really appreciate that. And I think Jeff reflected some of it when he talked about pivoting through partnerships when they're strong. I wonder if there are ways that any of our associations or just kind of field leadership can help in that. If either of you have ideas about how associations can serve us now as the field is changing.
I've long thought that there are associations that we just don't do the greatest job connecting with. You know, the sort of Association of College and University Attorneys, for example, right? If we're talking about the NACAWA group. And I think there are still opportunities in some of those sort of the NACUBO business officers, right? Some of the associations that were sort of like, yeah, how do we get our foot in the door there? But now that the conversation is about COVID for all of us, I think we might have a better opportunity to walk into business officers and say, let's talk about the connection between what we do and how that's impacting you. So those are exciting. I think the sort of the normal, NASPA and sort of really connecting again to those who do academic advising for students, especially as we create different opportunities, different programs, different ways of thinking. That would be a really robust place to sort of talk about adding different dimensions to your undergraduate experience through pieces of the puzzle that we're putting together with Global. And I know I haven't spent a lot of time with those associations, except for maybe NACA. Well, I've spent more time than I care to admit on that. But I think we have more to do. And I know some have been really involved, but I know lots of us haven't, honestly.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Lisa. And I don't want to sound critical of the professional organizations that we have in our field, because I know the people, I care about them very much, but I actually think we have more to gain from those that are not. I think that, you know, some of the best ones that I have been to in my entire career have been K-12 conferences where I've shown up, and in one that was in New York, you'll forgive me, I don't remember the name of it anymore, it's been some years. I was the only higher education administrator there, and it was fascinating. It was wonderful. And so I actually think that there are things we can learn, not just from the professional associations with whom we're used to working, and advocate for them to do more on this front, and move them where we consider appropriate moving forward, but also take a look at the landscape of what's already out there. You know, all the people who are working in student affairs, all the people who are working in career services, as Lisa has already said, all the lawyers and risk managers of the world, right? To start to broaden our landscape of what we would consider professional development for global education, recognizing that we touch a lot of different units on our respective campuses, particularly now when many of us will not be so pigeonholed into one modality. And I do want to talk quickly to Jake's comments on what we think higher education administrators are thinking in terms of preference to getting people overseas again. I know, and I can give you the anecdote because I don't know countrywide, but the anecdote from Pitt is that our leadership is very supportive of us, and they want us to be able to send again when it is safe. But it is not a high priority right now because they're still trying to figure out, rightfully so, how they handle what they're doing on campus tomorrow with pandemic response, and then planning for a spring term that is as of yet uncertain. And so it is not a regular topic of conversation, other than the fact that when we are asked, they say, we are very supportive of you, we will do this again. But I don't see them making any great push to us to say, you must get people overseas this spring. I think it's quite the contrary, where we'll make the case as to when it's safe and when we think we can manage again.
Thank you both. Really appreciating your answers, your discussion, and you're taking time with us today. We are getting close to the end of time. I know Julie has a very brief, trust me everyone, extremely brief survey she's going to drop into the chat, because we are grateful for Jeff and Lisa giving their time, and we work with Pacey, and we want to know that you know, how to spend our time and resources appropriately to see if it's supporting folks in the field and thinking together. So I do hope you got something out of it. We want to know either way how you felt about today. And I hope you'll join me in thanking, chatting, calling in, thanking, however you want to do it, Jeff and Lisa, as we close in the final minute here. If you two have any final words, feel free. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you for having us. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Please take a moment with the survey, folks. And thank you, Julie, for organizing as well.
I, for one, will look forward to when we can see each other in person again.
Yes, absolutely. Good luck, everyone, with decision making.
Thanks, friends.